In this video lecture, we're going to be looking at Abhidharma metaphysics. Specifically, we're going to be looking at the question of how it is that the doctrine of no self makes sense. All right, so we're going to look at a certain systematic construction of a metaphysical account of what they call dharmas that are meant to explain how it is that there is no self at all, that there are no natures to things. So Abhidharma generates out of one of the major Buddhist traditions, Theravada Buddhism, right? So there are three main ones after, the Buddha dies and so on, and after some time, different ways in how they interpret, what the Buddha argued in the commentaries and so on, in the discourses, emerge from that. So you have Theravada Buddhism, which is the earliest of these big traditions to emerge out of early Buddhism. They are mainly practiced today in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia, like, Vietnam and so on. Mahayana Buddhism is the next one that emerges in the history of Buddhist traditions. They mainly exist today in China, Korea, Tibet, Japan, and Mongolia. And then there's also Vajrayana, which emerged from Mahayana as well later on, which exists mainly in Tibet and Mongolia. So, right, Abhidharma wants to defend the doctrine of no self. So their metaphysics is that only things with parts are ultimately real. Right? Wholes are not real at all. We saw this with the chariot example, right? So a chariot is made up of a bunch of different parts, the wheel, the spoke, everything else, right? And so we can examine any of those things, and those contains the nature of what makes a chariot a chariot. But we know in the same way with like a human being, right? A human being is made up of a bunch of different parts. I have a physical body. I have memories, I have beliefs, I have volition or a will, right? Consciousness and so on, right? And we would say each of those things cause other things, and because they are really, when we investigate what a self is or what a chariot is, they're really all these parts, and no chariot or no self is found. Therefore, they say, well, really, only things with no parts are ultimately real. So this is a really general question, an ontological question here about what is most fundamentally real, right? So we're not exactly getting into a question about specifically how do we describe a chariot? What is the nature of a chariot? Or what is the nature of a person? We want to know, what is it that is the most fundamentally real thing that makes it possible to speak about natures at all? Right, so this is dealing with questions of ontology then, right? There are four possible answers to this question in terms of mereology, so the study of wholes and parts, how things relate to one another. So of the four possible answers, there is first the answer that wholes and parts are both real, that the whole is real, but parts are unreal. Neither whole nor parts are real, so they both don't exist, ultimately. Or that the whole is unreal, while it is only parts that are real, right? And this is going to be the case for this is really made, of course, in like the chariot example. And this is going to be the position that Abhidharma is going to defend, that the whole is unreal, right? In the same way that the chariot is unreal, it's just a convenient designator, a label we put on an aggregate of parts. And therefore, only parts are real because it's the parts that make up the whole. So let's first, before we actually consider the first possibility, this is the most difficult one and it's the most intuitive. But let's consider the second possibility first, that the whole is real while parts are unreal, right? To say this would be to say, well, the chariot is what is actually most real, but of course the parts that make up the chariot are not, right? So there is such a thing as a chariot, but there's not really a thing that is distinct from the chariot, like the wheel, like the axle, like the seat or the reins or whatever else, right? In the same way it would be to say that, well, a tree is real, but its leaves and branches are not, or persons are real, but the bodies of the persons and their mental activities and so on are not. Now, we could quickly see that, well, if then parts are unreal, it is wholes that are real. Well, we of course know that a chariot is but a part of many other, a part of, let's say, like a human society, because humans make chariots. Persons are, of course, parts of humanity as a species that exists. So persons, then we would have to say, aren't really real. It is the human species that is real, but not the individual persons, or individual humans. In the same way with trees, right? We would say, well, okay, individual trees aren't real, but trees as a species are real. Or then we might want to say, well, because trees and persons make up, we're part of nature, well then persons as a species and trees as a distinct species aren't real. Nature is what's really real. But what we call nature really is just one aspect of, the universe as a whole. So that's really not real either, because again, right, only wholes are real, parts are unreal. So we quickly would have to end up endorsing ontological monism, right? So the view that all things are really just one, right? That if everything we can think of is really a part of a bigger whole, then all is really one whole, right? And this is the argument that was put forward by Advaita Vedanta and the Hindu philosopher Shankara. Now, the Buddhists are going to say, okay, if we consider this possibility, why would we think that this is any better of an argument than, let's say, the Buddhist view that there are only parts but not wholes? Right? So why would this ontology, that all things are just one whole, useful? Very quickly, if you start to look at the practical, we could say like cash value of this theory, we would want to say, okay, well, if I believe that everything is really one, and there's no real distinct difference, right? That's just an illusion. Then would it be useful to say that, well, beer and bleach are really the same. So it doesn't really matter which one I drink because it's all really the same. Obviously, it's not all really the same. Bleach is going to kill you. I mean, beer, of course, over time can kill you, but in moderation, right, it's not likely going to do so. There's a very real practical difference between drinking beer and drinking bleach. So practically, it doesn't make sense at all to say that everything is really just part of one big whole at all. So, of course, Buddhists are interested in, okay, is this going to help me overcome the problem of suffering or not? Well, it appears that if we take everything to be one big whole, it's not going to help us overcome the problem of suffering. Therefore, they think we should, Abhidharma Buddhists think we should reject ontological monism, the view that the whole is real while parts of things are unreal. What about the third potential view, that neither the whole nor the parts are real? That nothing at all, therefore, exists. Right? So there is no chariot, and there's also no parts to the chariot. There's no tree, and there's no parts. The branch doesn't exist, the leaves don't make it exist either. There are no persons, and there are no mental activities, there's no consciousness, there's no physical bodies or anything else. Those also don't exist. Now, some people think this actually is the view of Buddhism, but this would be a mistake, right? This is what is known as ontological nihilism, that nothing at all exists. Now, we can quickly dismiss this if we just ask the question, right? Okay, well, if nothing exists at all, how can I be thinking about the existence of nothing existing? Right? So, if nothing exists, then there could be no thoughts about the fact of nothing existing at all. That couldn't occur. But, of course, I am thinking about whether or not anything exists or not. So, by considering the very possibility of ontological nihilism, that there are neither wholes nor parts, that these aren't real at all, it must logically be the case that something does exist, because I can only consider this possibility if things do exist. So we can say that this third possibility of ontological nihilism is false. Now, what about the first possibility, that both wholes and parts are real? This is the intuitive one. This is basically common sense, okay? We would say, yeah, I look out the window and I see there's a car. The car, of course, is made up of a bunch of different parts, of the axle, the wheel, the steering wheel, the engine, the body, the paint job, everything else, right? So it seems like we would just admit, yeah, there's a car, and there are also things that make up the car, right? So we can say like a chariot is real, and the parts that make up the chariot are real. A bicycle is real, and also the parts that make it up are real. A person is real, as well as their physical bodies and mental activities are real. So this is known as ontological realism. This is the kind of view that Nyaya, for example, argues in favor of. There are two different ways, though, that we can interpret this. So first we want to ask, okay, like taking the bicycle as our example, is a bicycle identical with or distinct from the parts when the parts are attached to one another in the right way? So we want to know, okay, we say there's a thing called a bicycle, which is the whole made up of the different parts of the bike, the pedal and the steering wheel and the wheels and the frame, all that, right? We want to know, okay, what is the difference between the two when they're connected or when they're not connected, right? When does the whole come into existence? So in asking this question, the first interpretation or first possible answer we could give is that whole and parts are both real and the whole is identical with the parts in relation. That we want to say the bike is real, but also the parts that make up the bike is real, and that what makes the bike is the fact that it is identical with the parts that are made up in a certain relation between them. If we put this into logical form, what we would be doing is saying, well, if X, the whole, the bike, and Y, the collection of parts, share the same essential attributes, then logically, we would be saying they are the same thing. Now, if that's true, we might then be saying, well, if the whole is really just the parts, then the whole is a conceptual fiction. And we would end up actually affirming the Buddhist position, the Buddhist Abhidharma position, that wholes don't really exist, but parts do. Of course, this would then be a way where you undermine this realist position, and you would end up embracing the Buddhist position. So it can't therefore be the case that the whole and parts are both real, while the whole is identical with the parts in relation. So perhaps then the whole is distinct from the parts in relation. So perhaps in this question of how the whole and parts relate to one another, then if they're both real, we might want to say, well, the whole and parts are both real, and the whole is distinct from the parts in relation. The first problem with this is that if this is true, then to escape an infinite regress of parts connecting to the wholes, the whole must exist as a whole in each of its parts, because we would have to ask, okay, if the whole is distinct from the parts in relation to one another that we say makes up the whole, we want to say, well, that's something else, of course, that makes it such that they can be identified in relation, even though they're distinct. Well, then what makes that identifier possible? You would need a different identifier. Otherwise, it would seem like it would become somehow both the whole and the part. If it becomes both the whole and the part, then we would just fall into the problem of the previous potential answer, and there are no wholes at all. It's a conceptual fiction. And we don't want to fall into an infinite regress then by saying that, well, there's always an external cause that makes it possible for the wholes and parts to relate. Now, this is, though, I have to say, a very, again, commonsensical and I think intuitive view. Because if we were to apply this, for example, to the color yellow, right, and we were to say, well, both the wholes and parts are real, but the whole is distinct from the parts in relation, we would say, well, okay, both, like a yellow marker, okay, we would want to say, well, the individual yellow marker, right, or the yellow that's made from the marker is real, but that is just a part of the whole, which is yellowness. And so we would have to say then that there must be a universal yellowness that is equally present in all individual things that are yellow. So in a way we would want to say, well, anytime, for example, we look at like a can, okay, I have this soda water can. I would want to ask, what makes it possible for the parts that make up, the different metals and materials and whatever else that make this can, this whole that I identify as a can? What makes it possible such that both we would want to say, well, the different parts, the metal and the lining that's on the inside and and the form and the colors. What makes it possible for me to say this is, the parts are real, but also this thing as a can, distinct from the parts, is real? We might want to say, well, there must be a form of can that is present in the whole, that is therefore present when all the parts come together, and so it's present in all the parts being together. That is the same than when we, if I had more cans in front of me, I would say, well, these are all, right, maybe participating in canness or something like that. The question is, how would we know that? How would we know that there is some universal canness that is present in all the different parts, making it such that the whole does exist as distinct from the parts, but the parts when put together creates the whole, because it's present in the parts themselves when they're arranged in a certain way. Now, Vasubandhu, someone here who is articulating the Abhidharma position, says, well, this explanation, which is put forward by Nyaya school, for example, the epistemology of it is unconvincing. I mean, how do we come to have this knowledge of the whole being distinct from the parts? So, specifically, he says, how is this known? For example, one does not cognize the cloth where there is, maybe sensory contact with a single thread. So let's say we have a blanket, and a blanket is like kind of under a table. But I see just the edge of the blanket, such that maybe I'm only seeing one thread or maybe a few threads, right? I mean, we wouldn't say that, well, just because I'm seeing a few threads, I'm seeing the blanket, right? I mean, if we took those individual threads and looked at them by themselves, we wouldn't say, these 3 threads are a blanket. So what is it that makes it possible when I see the 3 threads, maybe sticking out from under the table, I'm able to say, oh, there's a blanket under the table, right? I come to have knowledge that there is a blanket under the table. How is this possible, right? What, in the reverse, prevents then one from seeing the cloth? If I only see then 3 threads and I say, oh, there's 3 threads, I didn't know there was a cloth under the table. So one possibility, it is that it is in an incomplete state, that, of course, we only have a few threads, we don't have them all woven together to make the cloth. If that's the answer as to why maybe I see just the threads and not the cloth, even though the threads are attached to the cloth, I just can't see the whole cloth. Then Vasubandhu says, it is just a part of the cloth, not the cloth. And then the cloth would be merely the collection, right? A collection of different threads. And what part of the cloth is different from the threads, right? So here we're going to end up falling into the Buddhist argument. It's really just a collection of parts. Now, there being, he says, sensory contact with just the fringe of the cloth, and independence on contact of the fringe with the locus of the many parts, there would be perception of the cloth. The problem is, this never happens due to a lack of sensory connection with the middle and the extreme parts, because I only see, of course, one aspect of the cloth. Nor would there, he says, be cognition of the whole due to visual contact with the parts and successive connection. For if by just seeing some of the threads, we suppose that this is, how the whole is cognized, then the awareness of that cloth based on perception of the whole through successive connection is only found in the parts, as with the whirling firebrand, as if with, the succession of a combustion in seeing a fire. If that case, again, it falls back into the Buddhist position that, well, really, when we come to recognize something as, for example, being a cloth, it's really because it's just a collection of different parts together, but there's no cloth at all, because we never actually see the cloth. So these are 2 different problems, then, that the Nyaya is going to have to explain, that Vasubandhu says Nyaya can't explain. Their epistemology is unconvincing. So now we're going to look a little closer at the Abhidharma justification for the argument that wholes are not real, but parts are. So what then is ultimately real, right? We know, of course, conventionally, parts are real. They're saying ultimately, conventionally wholes are real. They're saying ultimately parts are real. What is it that makes parts real? I mean, of course, we know if I look at a chariot and I say, well, a chariot is made up of a bunch of different parts, well, those parts in a way also become wholes. So, of course, if I look at the wheel, well, the wheel is made up of many different other parts. I mean, I don't know chariots that well, but I assume there's like a metal band around it. That's one part. The wood, part around it, the spokes and the center and so on, right? These are all different parts. If I look at, let's say, like the metal band around it, well, of course, that is made up of a bunch of different parts, different, metal compounds and so on, and we could go further down and further down. So each part ends up becoming a whole that ends up becoming another part. Now, it would seem like then, therefore, this is going to lead to an infinite regress. Infinite regresses are not rational, because if you put forward an argument that falls into an infinite regress that always needs another justification, then that means ultimately it can never be justified. So what Abhidharma says is that the things that are ultimately real, which are parts without any other parts, are what they call dharmas. Now, of course, this comes from the Buddhist teaching, the true dharma, right? They call those infinitely small things, which are, essentially the basic building blocks of all things. Those are called dharmas. They are the ultimately real entities. Now, Vasubandhu says, when we want to look at things and determine whether or not they're conceptual fictions or ultimately real, when we analyze something, if we put it under analysis, that which disappears cannot ultimately be real, which is why when we put the chariot under analysis, the concept of chariot disappeared and we were only left with parts, which is why we were able to say, well, the chariot can't be ultimately real. Now, of course, then when we analyze each individual part, the same problem occurs and so on. But to do so, there are certain fundamental, as they're going to argue, qualities which are necessary to analyze things, which is why those must be the parts which are real. They have intrinsic nature, the dharmas. Vasubandhu says, so anything the idea of which does not occur upon division or upon mental analysis, such as an object like a pot, that is a conceptual fiction. The ultimately real is otherwise. Conceptual fictions are aggregative. They involve the mind putting together separate things and then constructing one thing to hold them all together. In the same way that, of course, if I look at myself from the time I was a baby or a kid or a teenager, now, an adult, I have different beliefs, different mental activities. My body, of course, we know cells die and so on, right? It seems, that in all ways, I am, we would want to say quantitatively, and especially then if I take into account my changing beliefs over time and my new memories and memories that fade, we would want to also maybe say I'm qualitatively different as well. Right, so when I look at myself, my mind, to think of myself as a single person, distinct person, Austin, my mind is putting together many different parts over time, constructing them to be one thing held together. Of course, again, right, this is an illusion. But this leads Abhidharma to say that only that which does not disappear then under analysis and continues being the same thing when we take its parts away is ultimately real, and we know that is not the case. There's nothing that can be found in the person that subsists over time. Now we can ask then there, right, more specifically about dharmas, what are the different kinds of dharmas that there might be? Now, atoms are some examples of what the Abhidharmas call dharmas. But they're not atoms in the sense that we think about in like physical science now, in like physics, we would say. Atoms, in the classical sense, both in like ancient Greece and in classical India and so on, atoms were just meant as like the basic building blocks of all things. And there was a general agreement among Buddhists that of the atoms that are, there's earth, wind, fire, and water. Now, Nyayas as well accepted this conception of what atoms there are. Now, what the Abhidharmas argue, though, about these different atoms, so we're going to consider just these kinds of dharmas known as atoms, earth, wind, water, and fire, that Abhidharma argues they are not, like, for example, earth atoms are not solid substances, but they're a particular occurrence of solidity. Nyaya wants to say, no. There are earth atoms. They are actual, like, hard substances, which is what makes them earth atoms. They're going to say there are actual substances that are liquid, which is what makes them water atoms. Abhidharma is going to say no, of course, because there are no things that subsist over time due to, of course, the doctrine of dependent origination. So what they say instead is that, yes, there is an experience of solidity or an experience of heat, right, coming from fire and so on. But these are occurrences. They are not substances. There are only qualities and no substances, right? So they argue that a pot before being fired and after being fired is experienced as a substance. It's a conceptual fiction the mind puts together where it sees, hey, there's like this clay that looks like one way. After being fired, it looks a different way. The mind puts it together and says, oh, well, these are just actually like one single thing. But what Abhidharma says is they are different. They are not only qualitatively different, but quantitatively different as well. Right? Nyaya is going to say the pot before and after being fired is quantitatively different, and that it's the same exact pot, but qualitatively different, of course. It's not going to be, malleable after being fired. Abhidharma is saying no. When we see this different quality to the pot, it's because that's all there are qualities. There are no substances. Dharmas, they argue, are qualities that are ultimately real and that only exist for an instant. Now, we do have to say there are many different kinds of dharmas, besides these atoms. We would want to talk about whatever is conceptually necessary, like perhaps a kind of color or anything else, right? We might want to say is an example of a dharma. But the question we need to look at now is, what exactly do they mean that dharmas are qualities that only exist for an instance, that they're not substances? So first we have to know, what do they mean by a substance? There are two understandings of substance. One is substance as property possessor. And the same way we would say, like, well, there's such a thing as a pot which possesses roundness, or it's a red pot. So it is a substance which possesses the quality of being red. So sometimes we think about things as being substances that possess other things. Of course, Abhidharma Buddhism is going to reject this because they previously, just generally argue that dharmas are not substances in this way, but also for the fact that you would have to ask then, what is this distinct thing that then possesses all these different qualities? And this would lead us into thinking that wholes actually exist. And already Abhidharma has argued wholes do not exist. So there are no substances as property possessors. But the other way in which we can think about substances is that which endures over time, where we would say, well, that is the same substantial car that existed before its new paint job, right? Previously it was green, now maybe it's red. We would say that car has subsisted throughout time, and it's the same one. Buddhists are also, though, going to reject this as well. Nothing subsists over time. Things only exist for a moment. And of course, all that exists are dharmas. So dharmas only exist for a moment. They cannot exist, one, just eternally, since, of course, this would violate the doctrine of dependent origination. So there's internal reasons for this, just according to Buddhist arguments. But you would want to ask, though, okay, if dharmas do not subsist over time, because if they were to do so, they wouldn't be, they would be outside of the realm of causation, and nothing is outside of the realm of causation. How can we make sense of this? How can we say that things are only momentary? That it is that they then do not subsist throughout time. So what the Abhidharma says is that dharmas go out of existence as soon as they come into existence. Now, why, though, do we think that things do last? Why do we think that there are things that do subsist over time, like myself as a person, like that car that was the same car prior to its new paint job? The answer they give is that at each new moment, so this has to do with our mind taking in sense data and putting it together, that at each new moment, what we see is a new similar dharma. So it's not exactly the same. It's not a logical sameness as in, like, X and Y are the same as Z, so they're really all Z. Instead, this is saying X and Y are so similar that the mind mistakes them for being the same. In the same way that when we watch a movie, we see a series of similar images pass by, right? So if I'm looking at someone that's staring at the screen and they're not moving, I might take that to be there is something that is persisting throughout time there when I'm looking at that face. Really, it's just a series of images being shown to me so quickly, the mind sees them as being continuous and not distinct. But this is what Abhidharma is saying, that when we experience things, when I experience this coffee mug, there's really no coffee mug that is solid, that subsists through time. It's really a causal series of dharmas some, for example, are the quality of solidity, which makes this solid, but it is not a solidity itself, because they come into and out of existence only momentarily. But we can look at a succinct argument, though, for momentariness. So what explains the cessation of an existing thing? How it is that there are no wholes at all, how it is that there are basic things, fundamental things that exist, that are dharmas, and how it is that they only exist for an instant and no more. Right? They're not substance, they're only momentary qualities. So what explains the cessation of an existing thing? First premise, when an effect comes into existence, it becomes a cause for a new effect. So when this, of course, this mug is the effect of a cause, which was all the things that were needed to build this mug, but it produces a new effect, which is the ability, for example, to hold this coffee that I can drink. Right? I think it's unlikely, I'll ask you, if you can think of anything that is an effect and does not become then a cause for a new effect. So, premise 2. After an effect is then produced, the cause ceases to exist. So, all those things that were required to produce this mug don't exist anymore. I mean, it's not the case that the mug, prior to being, for example, fired, if it's made out of, some kind of clay material or whatever, that doesn't exist anymore. It has to cease to exist for this mug as it now exists to exist. So you cannot have a cause that subsists after it has produced an effect. We might think of one example would be well, actually we'll look at it in just a moment, right? Let's say we boil water, and it seems that by that heat, it self-sustains boiling for a while. It seems like that cause then, while producing the effect of boiling, continues at least for a little while, making it continue to boil. This is going to be a mistake. These are really new causes that are consistently producing new effects, consistently producing new causes that are similar. And it's a mistake that our mind produces when we think of it as being a cause which is able to subsist while the effects, or maybe even multiple effects, are being produced over time. They're always new causes, is what the argument here is from the second premise. Now, the third premise is that the cessation of the cause is contained in the nature of a cause itself. The reason is that if this were not the case, there would be an infinite regression of effects needed to produce cessation. So we would want to know how is it that the cause ceases to exist when it produces the effect of creating this mug? Is it due to an external cause? Right? So there's a cause that ends the cause existing that creates this effect. If that were the case, you would want to know, well, what caused the cause that caused the ending of this cause? Well, what caused the cause of that caused, so on and so on, right? You would lead to an infinite regression. So you would have to suppose that the only explanation available is that there is just something contained in what it means to be a cause that makes it cease to exist when it fulfills the function of producing an effect. If that's the case, then if all things are produced by causes, and so they are effects, and all effects produce new causes, all causes cease to exist and the cessation of that cause is due to the nature of itself, then everything that exists is momentary. All that exists only for a moment. Now, how about that potential objection about, for example, how is it that boiling water seems to grow less, right? Over time, the water disappears while it's boiling without an external cause. So here's a reply from Vasubandhu. It is by virtue of its contact with fire, through the force of the fire, the heat element, which is present in water, right, when it's boiling, it increases. And increasing causes the mass of water to be reborn in quantities more and more reduced, until being totally reduced, the series does not renew itself. This is what contact with fire does to water. Therefore, there is no cause for the destruction of the things. The destruction, is just intrinsic to the nature of being a cause itself. Ceasing because of their transitoriness, being just arisen, they go out of existence. Destruction in an instant is thus proven, and from destruction in a moment, the absence of motion is proven. There is the conception of movement, right? However, so movement of water into a different molecule, right? An air molecule. But there is, when there is an uninterrupted arising in different locations, as with a grass fire, we wouldn't say it's the same fire that travels from one end of a field to another. We would say it is one momentary combustion, which causes another momentary combustion, which causes another momentary combustion, and so on, spreading throughout the field of grass until there's no more grass to be burnt. In the same way, we would talk about the way in which the boiling water ceases to exist. When it becomes air, it's not that it's the same water that subsists throughout time transforming into air. There is a cause that produces a new effect. And in this way, the boiling water does not move when it transitions into air. So this is the Abhidharma metaphysical argument as to why there are no persons at all. Why there are no wholes, like chariots. There are just parts. And why the only parts that actually exist are dharmas, and they only exist for an instant.